The fog rolled through the valley like something ancient remembering how to breathe, thick enough to swallow sound and light alike. From the highest window of the abandoned manor that overlooked the winding mountain road, the one the locals called Serpent's Pass, a figure stood motionless against the glass. Lord Caelan had watched this road for 217 years. He had seen carriages tumble from its treacherous edges. He had witnessed headlights disappear into the ravine below during storms that turned the asphalt into a river. He had heard the screams that faded into nothing, and he had done nothing, because that was the bargain he had made with solitude. He was not of their world. He would not interfere with their world. He would simply exist at the margins, forgotten and forgetting. But tonight, something stirred in the ancient chambers of his chest. Something that felt almost like a heartbeat. Through the fog, he could sense her before he could see her. Not her blood, though yes, that too, warm and vital and carrying the unmistakable second rhythm of new life, but something else. A spirit that burned darker than most, yet somehow brighter too. He had learned, over centuries, to read the energy of those who passed beneath his hill. Most were ordinary, tired commuters, lost tourists, teenagers seeking thrills on the dangerous curves. This one was different. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and watched the distant glow of her headlights emerge from the fog like the eyes of some determined creature. She was driving carefully, he noted. Slower than most. But the road did not care about caution. The road had its own intentions. Morgana Blackwood had been driving for 3 hours, and her back ached with a persistence that seemed almost personal. At 34 weeks pregnant, every position was uncomfortable, every moment a negotiation between her body and the small, restless life she carried. She reached down to adjust the lumber pillow wedged behind her and felt the baby kick in response, a sharp, deliberate jab that made her smile despite her exhaustion. "I know," she said aloud, one hand leaving the wheel to rest on her belly. "We're almost home. 20 more minutes. Maybe 30 in this soup." The fog pressed against her windshield like cotton, and she leaned forward slightly, squinting at the road ahead. Her wipers swept rhythmically, clearing nothing but the mist's memory of itself. The headlights revealed perhaps 10 feet of pavement before dissolving into white. She should have stayed at her sister's house. Cassie had begged her to wait until morning, had pointed at the weather advisory on her phone and made increasingly desperate arguments. But Morgana had her studio appointment tomorrow, the last major commission before her maternity leave, a massive mural for the children's wing of the county hospital, all dark forests and gentle monsters and stars that glowed in the dim light of a child's recovery room. She needed her own bed, her own space, her familiar routine of peppermint tea and 3 specific pillows arranged just so. Besides, she had driven Serpent's Pass 1,000 times. She had grown up in these mountains. She knew every curve, every guardrail, every place where the road tried to trick you into thinking it bent left when it actually bent right. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that half a mile ahead, a delivery truck had blown a tire 20 minutes earlier. The driver had managed to wrestle it to a stop, mostly off the road, but the fog had swallowed his hazard lights whole. He was somewhere behind her now, walking toward the emergency call box, believing the road empty. He was wrong. Kaelin felt the danger before it manifested, the way one feels a change in pressure before a storm. His hand tightened against the window frame, and something ancient and half-forgotten rose in his throat. He should not interfere. He had made his peace with that truth long ago, had accepted that his kind were not meant to save lives. They were meant to exist in the spaces between, to watch, to remember, to carry the weight of centuries without ever setting it down. But he could sense the child. Tiny, unfinished, utterly dependent on the woman who carried it. A heartbeat so small and rapid it was almost like the flutter of a bird's wing. That small life knew nothing of fog or roads or the terrible physics of metal meeting metal. It knew only warmth and darkness and the steady reassurance of its mother's voice. And it was driving directly toward something that could end both of them. Kaelin moved before he made the conscious decision to do so. He had not left the manor in years. The world beyond his walls had become strange, full of lights and noise and people who no longer believed in things like him. But his body remembered how to move through darkness, how to bend the fog around himself, how to cover distance in ways that defied the neat logic of human physics. He was on the road in moments, standing in the center of that treacherous curve, and he could see it all unfolding with terrible clarity, the truck, half hidden in the mist. The woman's headlights, approaching too quickly for the conditions. The exact angle at which her car would swerve when she finally saw the obstacle, and the exact spot where the guardrail had rusted through, leaving nothing but a 200-foot drop into trees and darkness. He could also feel what this would cost him. His kind could not die in the simple ways that humans did, but they were not indestructible either. The impact would hurt. The exposure to what came after, her screams, perhaps, or the flash of phone cameras of other cars arrived, or the simple raw sunlight of the emergency response, could weaken him in ways that took decades to recover from. There was risk here, real risk, the kind he had spent 2 centuries learning to avoid. But the child, that small, fluttering heartbeat, oblivious and trusting and utterly innocent. Kaelin had done terrible things in his long existence. He had taken lives, once, before he understood the weight of them. He had watched suffering and called it nature. He had closed himself away from the world because it was easier than caring about it. But this was not about making peace with his past or finding redemption. This was simpler than that, and therefore more powerful. There was a child who deserved to be born, and a mother who deserved to hold it, and he was the only one standing between them and an ending that neither of them had chosen. He spread his arms and stepped into the path of her headlights. Morgana saw the figure in the road and felt her blood turn to ice. It was not the seeing that made her react. Her reflexes were good, and her foot was already lifting from the accelerator, but the way he stood there, arms outstretched, as if he expected her to simply stop. As if stopping was still possible. She yanked the wheel left, away from the stranger, and felt the car begin to slide. Time did something strange then. It stretched and compressed simultaneously, and in that impossible elastic moment, she was aware of everything. The scream of her tires against wet asphalt, the lurch of her stomach as the car began to spin, the truck materializing out of the fog like a monster from one of her paintings, and beyond it, the gap in the guardrail yawning open like a mouth. She thought of her baby. She thought of the nursery she had painted herself, with its dark purple walls and the mobile of silver moons she had found at the antique market. She thought of the name she had chosen, Alara, for the smallest of Jupiter's moons, and how that small person would never know her now, would never learn to walk or speak or understand why her mother had loved the color black. And then hands were on the car. Not pushing against it. She understood somehow that pushing would have made everything worse, but guiding it, redirecting its momentum with a precision that seemed almost gentle. She felt the vehicle's arc change, curving away from the broken guardrail and toward the shoulder instead. Gravel sprayed. Something scraped against the undercarriage. The world spun one final time and then stopped. Morgana sat in the sudden silence, hands still locked on the steering wheel, and breathed. 1 breath. 2. 3. The baby kicked again, and Morgana felt tears spill down her cheeks before she even registered that she was crying. "We're okay," Ishi whispered, though she wasn't certain who she was talking to. "We're okay, little moon. We're okay." Through the cracked windshield, she saw the figure standing at the edge of the road. He looked like something from one of her paintings, impossibly pale, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to absorb the fog around him, watching her with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. There was blood on his hands. She could see it even in the dim light, dark and wet, and something about his posture suggested exhaustion, or pain, or both. She should have been afraid. Any rational person would have been afraid. A stranger appearing in the fog on a dangerous mountain road, pulling her car from a collision with his bare hands, now standing motionless in the mist like some Victorian spectre. These were not components of a comforting narrative. But Morgana had never been particularly rational, and she had learned long ago that fear and safety were not opposites. Sometimes the safest thing in the room was also the thing you were supposed to be afraid of. She unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed open the door, and stepped out into the fog. Kaelin had expected her to drive away. Humans, in his experience, responded to the inexplicable by fleeing from it. They were right to do so. The world contained things they could not understand, and understanding was not necessary for survival. Running was often the wiser choice. But this woman, this small, fierce creature with her dark painted eyes and her belly heavy with new life, was walking toward him instead. He should vanish. Melt back into the fog and the night and let her wonder, forever, what had happened on this road. That would be the safe choice, the careful choice, the choice he had made for 200 years. But the blood on his hands was hers, in a sense. Not taken, but spent in her service. The metal of her car had cut him when he redirected its momentum, and his kind healed slowly when they did not feed, and he had not fed in so long that the wounds still wept dark against his pale skin. "You're hurt," Ishi said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Not fearless, exactly. He could hear the rapid flutter of her heart, could smell the adrenaline still coursing through her blood, but she was not allowing that fear to control her. "It will pass," Ihi said. She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that he could see the details of her face clearly now. Dark lipstick, smudged slightly at one corner. Silver rings in her ears, tiny crescent moons that court the weak light. Mascara beginning to run from the tears she had shed inside the car. And beneath all the aesthetic choices, beneath the careful armor of her appearance, a bone-deep tiredness that had nothing to do with the accident. She was carrying more than a child, he realized. She was carrying something heavier. "You saved my life," Ishi said. "It was not a question. I redirected your vehicle." "That's the same thing." Kaelan looked at her for a long moment. He had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by someone, truly seen, not as a monster or a myth, but as a person who had made a choice. "Perhaps," he said. She reached out then, and before he could step back, her hand closed around his wounded one. The contact sent something electric through him, something he could not name. She turned his palm upward and studied the cuts with a clinical attention that surprised him. "These need cleaning," Ishi said. "And bandaging. There's a first aid kit in my car." "That is not necessary." "I didn't ask if it was necessary." She looked up at him, and her dark eyes held something that was neither fear nor gratitude, but something more complicated. Something like recognition. "You just saved me and my daughter. The least I can do is make sure you don't bleed out on a mountain road." "Daughter." The word settled into him like a stone dropped into still water. He had not known the child's sex, had only sensed its presence, but now he could see it in his mind. A small girl with her mother's fierce eyes and her mother's dark aesthetic, growing up in a world that would tell her to soften herself and learning, instead, to sharpen her edges. "You are not afraid of me," he said. She smiled then, a tired, crooked expression that transformed her face entirely. "I paint monsters for a living. The real ones wear suits and sit in boardrooms and tell women what to do with their bodies. You're just a guy who stopped me from driving off a cliff." "I'm not just a guy." "No," Ishi agreed. "I don't think you are. But that doesn't mean you get to stand there bleeding while I watch." She tugged gently on his hand, and Kaelan, Lord Kaelan, the vampire king of the Eastern Valley, ancient and terrible and alone, allowed himself to be led toward her car like a child being brought in from the rain. The first aid kit was well stocked, and Morgana worked with efficient movements as she cleaned and wrapped his wounds. She did not ask what he was. She did not demand explanations or recoil at the coldness of his skin or comment on the way the cuts seemed to close slightly even as she watched. Instead, she talked about small things, the murals she was painting for the hospital, the way the fog reminded her of the English countryside in films, the restaurant where her sister had made her eat too much pasta for dinner. Her voice was low and rhythmic, and Kaelan understood that she was not trying to fill silence so much as she was building a bridge between them, something ordinary and human to balance the strangeness of what had just occurred. "There," Ishi said finally, securing the last bandage. "That should hold." "Thank you." She sat back against the driver's seat and looked at him. The fog still swirled around the car, but it seemed less threatening now, less solid. In the east, Kaelin could sense the first faint suggestion of dawn approaching. "Will you be all right?" Ishi asked. "Getting home, I mean. Or wherever you need to go." "I will be fine." "That's what people say when they're not fine." He almost smiled. "Almost. I have survived for a very long time." Tonight was, unexpected, but not catastrophic. She studied him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she could see more than he intended to show. "Why did you do it?" "Save me, I mean. You didn't know me. You still don't." Kaelin considered the question. He could offer her comfortable lies. It was instinct. Anyone would have done it. He happened to be in the right place at the right time. But she had shown him honesty, and something in him wanted to offer her the same. "I have lived a very long time," he said slowly. "And for most of that time, I convinced myself that I was no longer part of your world. That what happened to humans was not my concern. It was easier that way. Safer. But tonight I sensed your daughter." He looked at her, and for a moment, the full weight of his years was visible in his eyes. "And I remembered what it felt like to believe that some lives are worth protecting at any cost." Morgana's hand drifted to her belly, protective and instinctive. But she did not look afraid. She looked thoughtful. "My mother died on this road," as she said quietly. 15 years ago. Same curve, same conditions. I was 19. Kaelin said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I've driven it 1,000 times since then," as she continued. "I think part of me always expected it to happen to me too. Like the road was waiting." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Tonight I thought it had finally caught up with me." "The road did not catch you," Kaelin said. "You are here. Your daughter is here. The road has no claim on either of you." She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, softened, opened. "What's your name?" "Kaelin." "Kaelin." She tasted the word like it meant something. "I'm Morgana. And this," as she patted her belly, "here is Alara." "Alara," he repeated. "One of Jupiter's moons. The smallest one." She smiled again, and this time there was something like peace in it. I wanted her to know that small things can still be extraordinary. The fog was beginning to thin. Kaelin could feel the approaching dawn like pressure against his skin, a reminder that his time in this moment was limited. He straightened and stepped back from the car. "You should continue home," he said. "The road ahead is clear now. Drive slowly. I know how to drive in fog." But she said it gently, without offense. "Kaelin?" He paused. "Thank you. Not just for saving me, but for," as she hesitated, searching for words. For choosing to be part of the world tonight. Even when it cost you something. He looked at her for a long moment, this strange, fierce woman who painted monsters and drove through fog and faced the inexplicable with steady hands and an open heart. And for the first time in 200 years, he felt something that was not loneliness or regret or the heavy weight of endless time. It was smaller than that. Simpler. It was the quiet knowledge that he had done something good, and that someone had witnessed it. Take care of Alara, he said softly. And yourself. I will. She started the engine, but before she pulled away, she looked at him one more time. Will I see you again? Kaelin considered the question. The safe answer was no. The careful answer was no. The answer he had given himself for 2 centuries was no. But safety and carefulness had nearly let a mother and child die tonight, and he was tired of being alone in a world that kept offering him reasons not to be. Perhaps, he said. On clear nights, when you drive this road, you might look up at the manor on the hill. If there is a light in the window, you will know that someone is watching. Someone who will not let the road claim you. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes entirely. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. It is not romantic. It is a promise. Same thing, sometimes. She put the car in gear, and then, almost as an afterthought, she said, and maybe one day I'll paint you. If you don't mind being a monster on a hospital wall. I would be honored. She drove away into the thinning fog, her taillights glowing red and then disappearing around the curve. Kaelin stood on the roadside until he could no longer hear her engine, until the only sound was the wind beginning to stir the trees and the first birds waking to greet the dawn. Then he turned and walked back up the hill to his manor, his bandaged hands aching and his ancient heart beating with something that felt almost like hope. 6 months later, a mural was unveiled in the children's wing of the county hospital. It depicted a dark forest full of gentle creatures, owls with kind eyes, wolves with soft fur, shadows that seemed protective rather than threatening. And in the center, watching over all of it, was a pale figure with outstretched arms, standing at the edge of a misty road. His expression was solemn but not sad, ancient but not weary. The children called him the Guardian. The plaque beneath it read simply, F for Kaelin, who reminded me that monsters can choose to save us. And for Alara, who taught me that small things are worth protecting at any cost. And in a manor on a hill, overlooking a winding mountain road, a light burned in the window every night. Watching. Waiting. Keeping his promise, for as long as there were lives worth protecting.